good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Every talk show, political discussion, news bulletin these days is just up in arms talking about the postponement of the local government election. There is, as we see, a complete disdain for with which systems, structures and institutions are being manipulated for self-interest, and perhaps there are those who watch the chaos unfolding and revel in seeing the frustration and angst among the citizenry to make sense of why democracy is in fact important for Sri Lanka. We've invited to the studio Pasanjay Singha. He works as a researcher at the Center for Monitoring Election Violence. Good evening and welcome, Pasan.
Good evening, Sonali. Pleasure to be here.
Good to have you here. Pasan, day in, day out, we have these conversations. We have such brilliant guests who come to our studios, and we have these conversations around democracy, the rule of law, why it is important to ensure that people are given the opportunity to exercise their right to franchise. Mm-hmm. There are theoretical constitutional reasons why this should be so. There are also practical ramifications of not doing this. One of the key arguments that we've heard being said by the powers that be is, look, there's no money mm-hmm. for elections. And this argument has been debunked by economists, by other experts. However, we see how there appears to be either collusion or manipulation of institutions which must essentially be neutral and objective and work towards the best interests of the public. Talk to us about how we can sort of get ourselves out of this mess that we're in.
Right. So, I mean, I'd love to fix the mess if I can, but as you said, Sonali, it's a huge sort of complicated series of institutions and series of, legal and constitutional concepts that are being wrestled with here, right? For something that should be a very simple process, the electoral process, which gives expression to the people's right to vote, which is something that all Sri Lankans have, that is enshrined in the constitution, that has been recognized by the courts in the country over and over again, and it should be a relatively painless process that happens regularly, so that people are allowed to express their opinions about who are governing them, what policies that are being affected on them, right? And this is a right that Sri Lankans have exercised for even longer than the independent history of the country, right? So since colonial times, and especially if you take the recent couple of decades of the country, which have gone through incredible turmoil, right? We've managed to somehow still manage to keep the necessary elections going, right? And so I think the argument that suddenly we have run out of money and suddenly we are in an unprecedented situation where we cannot have elections, it really doesn't hold. Mm-hmm. Especially when you compare to the fact that, during a 30-year-long, incredibly intensive and brutal civil war, we managed to keep elections going, right? And so this, and even going into the argument about money, it really, as you said, it really doesn't hold water because, even just on the very technical facts, right, the money for the elections were committed last year during the budget that the president himself, as the finance minister, presented, right? And that was agreed upon by everybody, and that was voted on by the parliament. And all of the public authorities that are involved in the electoral process also committed to that. And they were committed to that process all up until a few weeks ago, right? When they started acting in ways that were obstructing the electoral process. So a lot of this complication that we're seeing and a lot of the sort of hair pulling that everyone is going through at the moment, it's over something that should not be a problem. because this should be a simple process that gives expression to the people's right to vote, and the administrative and the legal and logistical aspects of that were also, in a very simple way, agreed to already during this crisis. So yeah, the fact that we are in such a turmoil and such a consternation about it right now is I think, a really damning indictment of the powers to be.
Pasan, when introspecting on the present situation, we've all heard some people would say things like, oh, I don't care if an election is held or not, it doesn't really affect my life, which is such a sort of douchey thing to say and also a privileged stance. But you get the other end of the spectrum where people are so helpless and live such insufferable lives that they genuinely can't care about elections. So there's a stark difference. The inequalities are so sort of dire. How do we view this sort of difference?
Yeah, I mean, we can look at elections and the concept of democracy in general as a way for people to express themselves, right? And elections serve as an outlet for people's views about their lives, about how they're being governed, right? And the fact that when you have regular elections, that outlet gets to be expressed, in a regular, predictable kind of way. It's when people feel like their opinions and their views about their own lives are not being respected or being properly even seen by the people that are governing them, that we see that people look to means beyond democracy or beyond these very sort of structural set defined institutions, right? And a lot of what we saw over the last year, for example, in over 2022, about the people's uprisings in multiple forms, right? Those were ways for people to express themselves out of the sort of structures that have been set in place, because they felt like those structures and those institutions were not respecting them, right? And so after having gone through all that experience, right, for the government to now say, okay, we are shutting down your outlet for expressing yourselves completely, is, I think, an incredibly sort of dangerous place to be in, right? And I think regardless of your opinions about whether you feel like your life is not being affected by these things, so you don't really care about what happens to the democratic process, or that your life has been affected so deeply by what's going on with the crisis, and I'm speaking specifically about working class and poor Sri Lankans, who are suffering enormously, right, in a way that a lot of people who are middle and upper middle class cannot even perceive, right, because it's a different country altogether. And those people might be so focused on what's happening to them and their lives that are getting harder and harder by the day, that they might not feel like the elections are a priority for them, right? Yeah. But for all of those people across the spectrum of political views, of classes, and of different demographics in the country, elections have always served as an outlet for their expression, right? And when you take that outlet away, that is when people start to feel extremely excluded from the process of governance, right? And from the governance of their own lives. And so regardless of people's stances about the elections themselves, they're a basic condition for people participating in society and for this country functioning as a society, right? And so there are huge repercussions to that right and that process being taken away, and we've seen those repercussions in this country, right? So previously as well, when elections have been delayed, when the right to vote has been taken away, and so just one example would be the 1982 referendum, which postponed the parliamentary elections for a number of years, right? And that was imposed by the uncle of the current president, and we saw that period right after that postponement was some of the bloodiest years in the country, right? And especially the exclusion of, say, the JVP from the electoral process at that time, the exclusion of various Tamil parties from the electoral process and from the democratic process at the time, that those things really exacerbated the sort of ethnic and political conflicts happening at the time. And so there's a huge precedent for postponing elections and for obstructing elections having really dire consequences for the country socially. So we can take that idea of people's opinions about elections and elections being an outlet for them, and we can also learn from our own history about what happens when we do postpone elections. And I think as citizens we can reflect on all of those things and wonder is this a path that we want to go down again?
It's very perilous to pit the citizen against the state. But with the current turn of events, what is happening is that there is a lot of anger and frustration that the citizenry feels against the state or the powers that be, that is denying them of their democratic right.
Yeah.
Speak about how dangerous this is, Hassan.
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we can speak from history, right, about what has happened in the country when people have felt like they can't express themselves. And I think what the danger here, especially now, is that we have a president who was not directly elected by the people, right, and we have a government that's appointed by him. That has also not been directly sanctioned by the people in the sense that there hasn't been a parliamentary election and a government formed straight after that, right? We're still dealing with the parliament that was elected in 2020. And so this isn't even a case of what would have applied for the administration of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, right? Which was a directly democratically elected president and cabinet and government and parliament who over the last year, right, that people felt like they had completely lost their way and then and made their lives worse, right? And so that whole period of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration, there was still a democratic link between the administration and the people, and he vacated his office when he felt like that link was broken, right? That he could no longer respond to the people. Now, what we have in place right now is a president and a government that doesn't even have that starting point that Gotabaya Rajapaksa had, right? And so, when such a government is making policies, making decisions for the people, they have to be extremely careful and extremely aware of that fact, right? That they have to bring. Because they don't have that direct democratic mandate, they have to bring all the people along with the decisions that they're making, right? Otherwise, it is, in essence, right, a dictatorship or an autocratic government. Now, when things like this are happening, where the government is not only clearly, not responding to the people, but actively taking away people's right? So in here, the people's right to vote, which even in a very long series of decisions and precedents set by the courts in Sri Lanka themselves have recognized that the right to vote is a fundamental part of people's freedom of expression, right? And that forms the sovereignty of the people that is enshrined in the Constitution. So when the government is taking that right away, right? So it's not even just being non-responsive to people; it's taking a right away, and that government itself happens to have no direct electoral mandate, right? You can imagine that's an extremely dangerous set of circumstances.
There's a quote by George Bernard Shaw, indifference is the essence of inhumanity. How does a government function without being accountable to the citizenry that it's supposed to protect the best interests of? I mean, there can't be a way out, right? I mean, a lack of accountability can't hold water.
No, absolutely not. And I think the way that the government intends to work has been how it has worked and functioned since it was instituted, right, in July of last year, which is by directly controlling the security and law and order apparatus, right, and turning it against multiple arms of citizenry who are trying to express themselves, right. And we saw that, we have seen that for, you know, that entire period from July on to now, where people's protests, people's expressions of discontent, which have, you know, in general been quite peaceful, you know, especially, you know, maybe compared to what came before that, and the government has, you know, directly repressed all of that, right, and so in a lot of ways, you know, interfered with people's right to express themselves, to their right to assembly, and so on, and this newest maneuver of taking people's right to vote away from them, you know, that just compounds the sort of functionality that the government has had all along, and you can imagine that that how the government will respond to this, and how the government will respond to people's reaction to this, right? So if people are disturbed by this, and I'm sure many citizens in the country are, and if they want to express themselves against it, we can kind of expect what the government would do, right? And I think in controlling the sort of law and order and security apparatus of the country in that way, and using it as a tool to sort of legitimize the taking away of people's rights, you know, that places the entire sort of social compact here in a very dangerous position, I think. And maybe, you know, that goes to, you know, I don't know what you want to call it, inhumanity or undemocratic or whatever, but it's definitely not anything good or desirable, right?
If we take the concept of separation of powers, the three organs of government, the executive, legislature, and the judiciary, there must be a system of checks and balances between these three organs of government. How can, at this juncture, how can the judiciary enable some sort of clarity for the people? Let's take the audience through that process.
Right. In the way that the separation of powers has been delineated in the Constitution of Sri Lanka, right, and how it relates to the electoral process in general, is that the Election Commission and the Public Service of Sri Lanka are empowered to enable citizens to express their right to vote through regular elections, right? And these elections are things that the executive and parliament must also respect, and they form the basis of how they are formed, right? So how the president's elected, how parliament's elected, and by extension how local bodies are also elected. Now the issue here obviously is that a lot of the public authorities that are involved in this election process have been acting beyond their mandate in terms of obstructing the process. And this includes, in this particular instance, the government printer, the secretary to the treasury, as well as the IGP and the Sri Lanka police, who have, for various reasons, expressed and done things that obstruct the electoral process as it should happen. Now, it is up to the judiciary to resolve the dispute, or to hear and determine the exact parameters of whose authorities lie where, whose jurisdictions lie where, and have, at a basic level, has the people's right to vote been infringed with as a fundamental right, right? And now, if we look at instances of obstruction of the electoral process in the past, and where it has come before the courts, the courts of Sri Lanka, and particularly the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, has been extremely clear that the right to vote is a fundamental part of the freedom of expression, which is a fundamental right in the Constitution of Sri Lanka, and that it cannot be interfered with by the executive and by the parliament, right? And that it should be allowed, that elections as the mechanism which gives effect to the right to vote must be allowed to proceed. And it has made this call on numerous cases which relate to delays of provincial council elections, local body elections, and in several instances about parliamentary elections as well. And in each of those situations, there were sort of similar issues arising where aspects of the public service or public authorities who were charged with affecting and operationalizing elections had been in some way influenced by the executive or parliament to, and particularly the executive, to not carry out elections. And in each of those situations where those delays or obstructions happened, the courts have very clearly said that that's not something that should have happened. And in each of those instances, the courts have ordered for elections to go ahead, right? And this has happened for decades in Sri Lanka now, and especially during instances which were difficult, right? And some of those instances were during times of intensive conflict, right? And the courts have said that the reasons brought forth by the executive about, say, for example, national security being used as a reason to not hold elections, that they do not hold, that the right to vote and the elections must proceed as people are entitled to that right? And so with any legal action that goes against the current situation and about the current local government elections, we would expect for the courts to uphold their previous views and to resolve this dispute between those arms of government, and especially within the administrative process of elections to enable the right to vote.
Okay, fantastic. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back here with the People's Platform. We're in conversation with Pasan Jayasinghe. He's a researcher at the Center for Monitoring Election Violence. We're discussing the breach or violation of the legitimate expectation of the citizenry to have regular elections in accordance with the law. Specifically, Pasan, we're discussing the local government elections which need to be held ASAP. Let's speak a bit about the impact that this delay can have on the people in general and also the constitutional ramifications. And let's also talk a bit about why it's important to care about the local government elections, which are the sort of lowest rung of governance. We're talking about the municipal election to municipal councils, urban councils, and Pradesh Sabhas. Why is it so important? Someone can say, well, I don't really care, it's not a big deal. But it is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? Let's start the conversation there.
Right. I think one of the things is that, because it's the lowest rung of government, people might think that, it's not completely important. But actually, in a lot of senses, the day-to-day lives of people are more impacted by the decisions of the decisions and especially the administrative actions of local government bodies, right? And so we're talking about things like even very simple things like the maintenance of roads, of garbage disposal and collection, right? All the way up to provision of welfare services, the provision of sort of arts and culture, of education services. There's multiple functions of people's everyday lives that are directly affected by the local government bodies, right? Now, the reason why it's important is that it's important for people to express themselves about how those things happen in their communities, right? Yeah. And so this is local government bodies, especially when it comes down to the lowest tier of them, right? Pradeshi Sabhas, which are in places that are outside of urban and suburban areas, where those Pradeshi Sabhas are small, and there's a very strong link between the people and their elected officials in that sense, right? And I think the importance of that here is that that people should be allowed to express themselves and about their sort of daily, everyday governance in a way, right? and the other importance of that is that we have to take this in context of what has been happening in the country over the last, 1.5, 2 years, right? Where it's gone through incredible economic and political turmoil, and where people have been extremely fed up with their systems, right? And I think a lot of the slogans from that arose during the people's uprisings, during the Aragale and so forth, about system change and about changing the way that we govern ourselves. Those things are really applicable to these elections, and they are applicable in such a direct grassroots kind of way, right? And so we're not talking about elections to the sort of executive higher up or the parliament, but your local elected officials, right? The people that you might even meet every day, and that you have a lot more direct access to. And so these elections are supposed to be the first opportunity since a lot of that political turmoil of last year for people to express themselves, right?
Yeah.
And for people to express themselves in institutions that are very close to their lives, and they were a way, I think, for people to again to in a lot of ways sort of vent some of that political frustration they might have had. Right? And I think in a much broader sense, for people to have some idea of is a new system possible, right?
Right.
Or are new ways of thinking about ourselves, about our governance and our democracy, can we envision that within this system of the local government system and within the electoral process itself, right? And so this was supposed to be, I guess, like the first chance for everyone to see that vision and see the impact of whatever the last 2 years have had on people's thinking and people's political expression, right? And so that is exactly the reason why taking this opportunity away is such an egregious thing, right? Because it's sort of spitting in the faces of people to say, okay, right, you wanted system change, right? Well, you can't have it. Even at this basic level of having elections for very small ground level electoral institutions. So yeah, I think that's the frustration here, and whatever anger or despair people might feel.
Yeah. Let's also speak a bit about the importance for voters to be aware of their rights and responsibilities and to be vigilant so that they can't get taken on a ride.
Yeah.
So I want to connect this to education and being vigilant and alert as a citizenry.
Yeah, and those things are incredibly important, right? And I think as people that are sort of involved in the media or people involved in academia or civil society, for them, it might be seen as extremely important. But I think that's it's an important thing for all of citizenry, right? And I think I kind of want to connect that a little bit to what I was saying about what was happening through the last year, right? And some of those very sort of potent conversations that were happening were about people saying, okay, we did get taken for a ride for the last 75 years, right? Because maybe we were in some ways not as vigilant, in some ways we trusted politicians too much, or that we let ourselves be sold down into particular ideologies or into particular ways of thinking about our country, and that that we should have had more awareness and definitely more knowledge, right? And I think I can definitely point to many instances throughout the last year, especially as the Aragale was starting, where people were getting very involved in civic education initiatives, and people were actively expressing this desire to be educated and to educate themselves, right? And that was supposed to be part of this system change or whatever it was, right? And I think again this was an opportunity for us to see, for that to happen, right? Because this is the elections are not just about what happens on election day; it's about the entire election campaign, And was this going to be an opportunity where people took up those ideas from that they were sort of committing to throughout the last year to learn more about their candidates, to learn more about these political parties and what they're promising, and to hold them to account, right? And so this process was, it could have been a test run for all of that, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why the fact that the process has been now stopped is frustrating and also dangerous, right? Because I don't think that was asking for too much.
Yeah.
It was a very basic part of the democratic compact that we can have as citizens, right?
I feel like most Sri Lankans have grown up with this concept of wanting a savior almost to come and save them.
Yeah.
And that concept is very much at variance with the concept of democracy and the rule of law.
Yeah.
How do you view that?
I mean, I think that that idea has persisted throughout Sri Lankan history, right? But we can also look at people's very high levels of participation in elections, right? And I think we can sort of definitely point to electoral turnout at various elections where in Sri Lanka, especially in the recent past, where turnout's been very high, right?
Yeah.
And that goes against a lot of trends in the rest of the world, especially the Western world, where democratic turnout is trending down and falling off the precipice in some cases. And I think definitely, of course, this idea of the savior persists, but I think in some ways, Sri Lankans are also always just looking for an alternative, right? And an alternative to the ways of governance that are presented to them, right? And I think in some ways, maybe last year presented a juncture from that sort of conventional thinking about saviors, about what we need to do as citizens, maybe to demand more from our leaders and to demand more from our systems, right? And I think that is what we could have built on using this instance, right? And I think there's definitely a tendency by elites and especially the people in power, right, to always sort of blame voters for their predicament, right? It's saying, because you are so uneducated or because you care so little about the things, that's why you have the system that you have, right? And in some ways, of course, voters must take responsibility and they are responsible for who they elect, right? But what is the entire system of democratic governance is that, and of representative democracy, is that we give our leaders, the powers to govern us and to provide us and to create the sort of institutions that will serve us, right? And so I think it's sort of unfair from the perspective of the elites and especially the elected leaders themselves to go, okay, well, you just want a savior, you're not good enough for anything else, and so just be happy with the really bad institutions you have now, right? And so democracy in that sense is a two-way street, and I think there was nothing from the side of the people saying that we want to not take part in elections, right? People weren't coming out on the streets demanding for elections to not be held, right? And so in that same, and in many cases, people stepping out on the streets asking for elections, right? And so if democracy is a two-way street, then the elected leaders and our leaders, who are not elected, have the installed leaders, have the responsibility to also meet citizens halfway, right? And to provide those institutions and provide those mechanisms where people can participate.
Speaking about accountability, the accountability has now stretched from being accountable to one's own citizenry to being accountable towards multilateral organizations and bilateral creditors to whom we've gone with a begging bowl, sort of. So the delaying and the postponement or the cancelling of the local government election.
Yeah.
How insane is this move?
Well, I think we can really go back to the president and the government's argument itself, right? That these elections are being delayed because of the state of the economy, and to ensure some sort of economic stability, right? But on the same hand, the president is also saying that for the economy to be revived, we need to come to these deals with the IMF, and as well as bilateral and multilateral lenders that Sri Lanka has, and that's the only way that we will get enough foreign investment in the country, and for them to give the okay for lending to happen and for debt restructuring and so on to occur at a speedy pace, right, for the economy to recover. Now, that's the argument of the president. But if we sort of really take that into account, multilateral and bilateral creditors, as well as the international financial institutions, they make their decisions based on the political stability of the country, right? And so I don't think they can look at what's happening now, where a country has not had elections for a long time after incredible political and economic upheaval, where a government is directly stopping elections from happening and go, oh, that looks like a stable country. We should, we should make deals with them and give them what they're asking for, right? I don't think you can make that argument anywhere, and I think in that sense, the argument of the president is not a very valid one. And I think it's also up to those international organizations, and particularly the diplomatic missions in the country, as well as the intergovernmental organizations and international civil society organizations, to really kind of make themselves clear about how they feel about what's happening, right? Because they've always been incredibly concerned about what's happening in the country, and they were quite vocal as the upheavals of last year were happening. But I think this move of the people's right to vote being directly taken away, I think that is a very basic fundamental right of people that's being denied. And I think those are not things that that if I was looking at Sri Lanka from outside, those are not things that would inspire confidence in me that this is a stable country that just needs help, right? It might need help, but they should, the government of the country should do things to sort of inspire that confidence to give help. So.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Pasan Jayasinghe, researcher at the Center for Monitoring Election Violence. Thanks so much for being a part
Pleasure
of this
to be
show.
here.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again on Monday with the Sinhala edition of the People's Platform. Have a safe weekend. Good night.